Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to start with this new reading. The facts in the case of Mr. Valdemar were written by the American author Edgar Allan Poe. This story was published in 1845 by American Greek Review magazine. The story begins with a scientist who is a hypnotist as well. He was very interested in hypnotism. He explained that hypnotism helps ill people as they sleep. He had patients who had illnesses and people who were mentally ill. He said when they got hypnotized, their thoughts actually helped their bodies and minds. These patients were always listening to the hypnotist's words while they were sleeping. But how did he hypnotize people? Indeed, he did this by moving his hands in front of their faces and speaking slowly and very clearly. A few seconds later, the patients slept, but they were still awake. They followed his orders and every instruction, and heard everything the hypnotist said. The scientist clarified there were people who were easier to hypnotize than others. He can't hypnotize people who didn't want to be hypnotized. One day he had an idea. Nobody was hypnotized before that, so he started thinking about that, but he wasn't able to study until Mr. Valdemar, a scientist like him, arrived to his life. Mr. Valdemar had a disease in his lungs. He was going to die sooner or later, but he didn't want to have a painful death. That was his scariest nightmare. The hypnotist told him he was going to hypnotize him before his last breath. Valdemar was delighted by this. He was frightened by the idea of dying in horrible pain. A Saturday night, Mr. Valdemar sent him a note. His death was very close. When he arrived, Mr. Valdemar's doctor was there, but he could do nothing more but wait for his patient's death.
A few minutes later, the doctor left the room and said goodbye to his patient. Nevertheless, a nurse stayed in the room. Mr. Valdemar was sitting in his bed. He looked pale and thin. Then, Mr. Valdemar asked the scientist to hypnotize him before midnight, since he will die. The scientist started to move his hands in front of Mr. Valdemar's face. Suddenly, his eyes wandered, and soon he was asleep. The nurse and the scientist laid the patient flat on the bed. Mr. Valdemar was breathing very slowly. In this moment, the scientist held a mirror up to his lips to see his breath and verify that he was alive. So it was, but he was very weak. The scientist asked to Mr. Valdemar if he was asleep, and the sick man replied that he was alive, but he asked that they not awake him up, since he was dying. Then the scientist saw Mr. Valdemar's mouth and saw his tongue. It was black. Suddenly, all the breath came out of Mr. Valdemar's body, and he was quiet. Mr. Valdemar was dead, but the scientist was surprised when he talked to him, and he replied, "I've been sleeping, but now I'm dead." After this, Mr. Valdemar did not change. He was dead, and the scientist tried to speak to him again. The next morning, Mr. Valdemar's doctor returned.
The doctor said that he couldn't sign a death certificate because Mr. Valdemar didn't look like a dead person, so he decided to wait another day. The doctor went the next day, but Valdemar looked the same way as the previous day, so there was no change. His body didn't move, he didn't breathe, and he didn't speak. One more time, the doctor decided to wait until the skin and flesh become black and bad. That means that Mr. Valdemar is dead. The scientist waited 7 months, but the body didn't change. At the end of that month, he decided to end the hypnotism, so he moved his hand in front of Mr. Valdemar's face and said, "You will wake up." Suddenly, a yellow liquid came out of his ears and he asked, "How do you feel? Can you speak?" He heard a voice from Mr. Valdemar's body that said, "Quickly, make me sleep or wake me up. Quickly, I'll tell you that I am dead." And more yellow liquid came from him. It had a terrible smell and the body started to disappear. It became liquid, and at the end there was nothing more than a pool of yellow liquid and some bones. Okay guys, that's all for our presentation. I hope you enjoyed the book.